We're at Korea Blockchain Week in Seoul, and I'm speaking with Yat Siu, who is the co-founder and chairman of Animoca
That's right.
Brands.
Yes.
Digital property rights. The cornerstone of the Web3 movement is digital property rights, and that is what Animoca has kind of targeted and
It's our
been the
mission statement.
pioneer of.
It is our mission statement. Yes.
Why are digital property rights so important?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, first of all, one of the problems we have in the digital world, which is currently more like a Web2 state, is we actually don't own anything online. I mean, do you own your Instagram handle? Do you own your TikTok handle? Or do you own any of that? In fact, even the gaming assets that you have when you're playing Fortnite or Roblox, you don't own them, and they can be removed at any time. You know the amount of money that gamers spend on skins, and when the game shuts down, you lose all of that. Yeah. And you can actually take any of the province in history with you. But outside of that injustice, there's the other problem, which is that I can actually not create the kind of value that ownership gives me. So when you go down to the fundamentals of us as humans, actually the fact that we could have property rights starts even with our own name.
Yeah.
Right? So when you think about the fact that, why do so many people have names like in German, for instance, like Metzger, which is butcher, right? Or which city they're from. It's because actually they used to be serfs that were working for the lords. They owned the name, they owned your name, they owned your property, your personal property, and they controlled you because essentially you were their slaves. And what happened when people actually realized that they had property in their own name first, then they began investing in themselves. Oh, wait a second. I have a legacy. I have children I want to pass things on to. I have a multi-generational approach. Your mindset shifts from I only exist for this moment in time to I actually exist for maybe past my life and I'm building something more valuable. And so I'm investing in the future and your mindset completely changes, right? And we see this, of course, in objects like real estate. Why can I buy a piece of real estate? And it's worth basically 20, 30 years of forward rent. Because this real estate is something you can own forever, presuming the government exists at that point.
Yeah.
And you have a freehold, which means it's a property that you own forever. Therefore, it's not a problem for me to pay forward value, and that's how wealth is created. Also, property rights is the foundation to build network effects on top. For instance, a favorite example I often give is the car industry. The car industry is a utility industry where really when Henry Ford basically mass-produced these cars, it really took you from point A to point B really well. But actually what happens is because I have ownership of the car, someone else made a baby seat and built a business around that. Someone else created new tires. Someone else painted the chassis red. And now today we have industries where you have an Uber or a Lyft. We have different sort of audio systems. We have cars that have different colors and shapes. The industry, what supports the car industry, is multiples larger than the selling of the car in itself. Right?
Yeah.
And that's only possible because you have decentralized property ownership of that car asset. This can't happen in a class of assets that is not owned by the community or by the people using it. So for instance, if you look at franchises like, for instance, like the NBA, right? The sport of NBA, basketball, is big because the community owns basketball in a sense. So anyone else can make basketball shoes and everyone can make other industries. But the license of the NBA in itself is not. It belongs to the NBA. But if basketball wasn't public domain, if it wasn't something that everyone else can build property on top, it wouldn't be that big, right?
Yeah.
And that to me is basically the foundation of property rights. And one more thing to close off in the physical world. Every country that has property rights has a bigger GDP. So whether this is UAE, like in Dubai, here in Korea, actually Korea is a great example. 40 years ago, the GDP of South Korea was smaller than North Korea, and it was a military dictatorship. What changed? They became a democracy, they embraced capitalism, therefore property rights, and today it's the 12th largest GDP in the world. Right? And look at America, or Europe, property rights, better GDP. Look at North Korea, no property rights, basically dismal GDP,
Yeah,
right?
non-existent.
And also no freedom, right? So that's a parallel, and we see the same parallel in the digital world. If I own my digital identity, if I own my digital assets in the digital world, then Instagram can't take away my property rights. The game company can't remove my my achievements, for instance, right? All the status you achieve online could be something you transfer on. So that is the future. That's why it's so important. And if you believe, as we do, that the current multi-trillion-dollar Web2 infrastructure is a zero property rights infrastructure, which is what it is, imagine what it would be like if we introduce property rights. The GDP of a property rights country is roughly 30 to 40x of one without. So we think in the same way that the multi-trillion dollar, let's say Web2 ecosystem will become, a 50 to 100 trillion dollar ecosystem with property rights. And that's why digital property rights is so fundamental.
Okay. There's a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
I do want to go into like kind of what an Instagram, Web3 Instagram is versus a traditional one.
Yeah, so maybe one way to sort of unpack it for people who might not fully understand this is that the property you own in Web3 is a network effect. This is something that people couldn't own before. When you think of property, you say, do I own a house? Do I own a car? It's physical. But actually in Web3, when you own a token, you own a network effect. You don't buy Ethereum because it gives you great yield. It's okay.
Yeah.
But the staking rewards pays you less than T-bills.
Yeah.
Right? So really, from a return standpoint, that's not why you own it. But you own it for its membership, for the fact that you can benefit from the growth of the network. And what is the growth of the network? It's network effect. And so what is Instagram? Instagram is a network effect, right? But when you own equity in Facebook, it doesn't give you a benefit of Instagram. I could be a big shareholder in Facebook. It gives me zero credibility in Instagram. I have no
Yeah. There's no
tie.
Your followers in Facebook have nothing to do with your followers in Instagram.
Yes, but also your ownership of Facebook has nothing to do with your network effect in Instagram, right?
Yeah.
So the two are two separate constructs. And what we think is that actually if you can free the network effect and make them community owned, they become more powerful, which is what we see, for instance, in Ethereum and Bitcoin. The fact that it's decentralized and community owned is what gives it power. In fact, if you monopolize the network, actually the value goes to zero, for instance, right? So in our case, it means that we think that if Instagram was a token, actually, and likes and so on were a form of tokenized currency, then actually it wouldn't just be about more value. It would be more sort of validating the network effects that are there. The problem today is that Instagram's followers and likes are purely inflationary, right? So even Instagram in sort of virtual ways are inflating their economies. 1 million followers today, good, but you know what? Not so good, right?
Yeah.
Actually, right? If you had 1 million followers 10 years ago, whoa, you're like top, right?
Yeah.
But did the population of the world change? Not really, right?
Yeah.
When you think of it that way, it's because essentially the value of the network increased because more people went in, but they inflated it by essentially people just giving out likes and follows like crazy, much like a form of, let's call it QE in money.
Yeah.
It's actually what the social networks have done.
Yeah.
But it's exactly the same effect. So it's devalued the actual native currency of social currency in the same way that money has been devalued, right? I mean, just think about, frankly, 10, 20, 30,000 followers is not really a big deal, actually, in comparison.
We just got 30,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel, so it's a lot.
Yes. No,
I'm kidding.
It is a lot, but in relative terms to everyone else, what they have,
it
feels not as big as it was if you had done this 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? And that's similar. But my point on this one is that they've essentially demonstrated the value of network effects through followers and likes. Right? So you have a way of feeling the network effect. Oh, I'm working with you because you have 100,000 followers, so I think your network's worth 100,000, right? That's created a value construct. It's not nothing, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is, can you prove that it's real? And also, do you know what the value of the network is? For instance, I think I sort of said this in a recent interview. If Elon Musk was to follow me on X, which he doesn't, but anyway, no pressure. But anyway, if he was to follow me on X, actually, my network value would be greater, even though it's only +1.
Yeah.
Because actually he's worth a lot more than most of my followers in aggregate because he has that much more impact.
Yeah.
These are things that, network effects should be able to enumerate, but because every like and every follow is treated the same, it's essentially more of like a socialist infrastructure, essentially saying that everyone's kind of treated the same, which is not true at all, right? And I think this is an example of sort of how can we create more deeper understanding of our networks, who are our 1,000 true fans, who are the people who really care about us. Like, for instance, in your YouTube channel of 30,000, you probably have a few people, like thousands of them, that are probably watching your channel religiously all the time and everything. And you might have a lot of them who basically watched one video and follow you, but probably don't watch it as much. And clearly, one user is more valuable to you than the other. But do you know who they are? Can you reach out to them? You can't, right? Not in Web 2, but in Web 3 you can, which is why tokens and blockchain is so powerful. Anyway, it's a long way of saying that in Web3, through tokenization, you can own a piece of the network effect, which is essentially you contributing to the network, you make it more valuable. Just think about it. You're bringing more people into YouTube, you're creating more content, you make YouTube more powerful. But do you own a piece of YouTube? No, right? And through a token, you would be able to. That's basically how we think of it.
I like that construct a lot. My kind of biggest thing when it comes to like let's say Web3 Instagram or anything digital is bots, right? Like you don't know what's real, what's fake anymore. That's another
Yes.
thing in the inflation thing that you
Yes.
spoke about. And with
And this is true for
AI,
airdrops as well.
yeah,
Exactly.
I mean,
Absolutely.
and like I even listened to your talk on AI as well earlier, and kind of the AI models are becoming so realistic, and it's getting so much like a lot more difficult to even tell what content is AI generated versus what
Yes.
is not. As we go into this world where people are like on computers more digital,
Yeah.
how does Web3 prevent bots from taking over the space?
Basically, I think it's exactly the same as how we build reputation systems, but in Web3 can be at scale. In fact, that's what we're trying to solve with Mochaverse, with the Mocha ID. So in the physical world, how do we prove not just that we're human, but that we have a reputation? Well, we go to college, we have a degree, we create symbolic capital. That symbolic capital is our reputation. If you've worked in the industry for 10 years and you're known for that, you've built a reputation. And the reason why you don't want to immigrate to another country or have a new name is because you will throw away
Yeah.
decades of your reputation from the past and you have to start from zero. You don't want to do that, right? So you want to maintain that reputation. So how do we build the same effect in Web3 where I don't want to throw away my reputation because I know that if I do good things, it accretes to my future, which is how the real world works. And that's what we're trying to do with digital identity and Mochaverse. Because if I play this game and if I dump my tokens on day one, well, I will know that now, right?
Yeah.
Or if I, basically don't contribute to the network and I'm just there and I just spend 5 minutes in the game, well, I'll know that, right? You know the difference in people who play games. Those who actually play a game every day versus the ones who play a game once a week. Clearly, there should be a difference between the two.
Yeah.
Then what happens is you as a company might say, I want the gamer who plays the game every day. Am I going to give you a bigger airdrop? I think so, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the problem is that even though everyone in Web3 is capitalist, we're not thinking capitalist enough in the sense that we should be giving merit to the ones most deserving. And I think right now we're still going through the process of everyone shows up and gets something. It's a little bit like, when you're in primary school races, everyone gets a medal.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the reality is someone did get first prize, right? But everyone gets a medal for showing up and there is no winner. And I think that's part of the problem because that's not how the world works. And that's not how we create value because we need to know who contributed the most, who put the most effort. That's how it works in a company, right? If you're working in a company, if you provide effort, you're appropriately compensated for more work, hopefully, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to in a more socialist environment where it's like, well, you did a good job, but you're only going to get a little bit more, actually, or maybe not more at all, even though the other guy doesn't work as much because you're in the same role. How do you feel about that, actually, right? So that's actually similar in the Web3 world. And now because everyone's treated the same, you can farm it with bots because you can't tell the difference for someone showing up if he's human or not. Reputation is important. So I think this is what's so critical. And in time we'll solve this because the reputation you build today will accrue over time, like in the real world. I'm going to be giving much more value, bigger airdrops, bigger benefits to the customer I know is doing stuff and is showing up. One of the things why NFTs are so powerful is that if I buy a Bored Ape, which is expensive still at 13 ETH or so, give or take, I'm actually staking my reputation and putting my money where my mouth is. And that's respect already, right? Right? As opposed to me going on Instagram and taking a photo next to, a Ferrari and saying, look at my Ferrari. Do I know you burnt this?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's people are trying to.
A lot of
The influencers do this and
the
stuff like that.
influencers do, they rent something that looks like a private jet, like
Right.
the inside of it, and then they take a photo like they're flying somewhere, but it's
Yes.
really just like not
Yeah.
even a jet. It's just
I
it looks like
didn't even know about
yeah,
that.
no. Apparently,
But
it's like
yes.
a fake like
Yes.
studio of a jet.
But there's so many things people do to try to elevate their status. But actually, you want to know who has the real status, who is deserving of it, whether you purchased your way into it or earned your way into it. That's reputation. And by the way, I don't mean that I have to know your real name. If you built an on-chain reputation for many years and proved something, you're valuable. I mean, if Satoshi came to life, what do you think his reputation is going to be? Not in real. You might not even know who he is. Just his wallet comes up, the whole world will go, oh my god, right? And he will probably have godlike status because he's established a reputation for really having done nothing in the sense of not for what he did, but in terms of his moving his wallet. But that activation alone is godlike reputation.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what I mean. You don't need to know whether Satoshi is alive per se, or even one person or persons. The wallet itself can be a container of reputation because of his actions in the past. That's what we need. That's what we're trying to solve with Mochaverse ID and digital identity. And over time, as you build more value and more reputation, you will get more value as a result. Because really, every project, every game, every system, every person would want to work with someone with a good reputation, ultimately.
Yeah, I really like that. And one thing about capitalism that I see is that there's a big misconception about capitalism in general. Like a lot of people think that it's just the 1% are better off, the wealthy get wealthier, whereas it's actually fosters true digital or true property rights and competition, which
Yes.
make everything more efficient.
So, to your point, though, I think there is a reason why, particularly in the West, people are angry at capitalism, and that's because they haven't been included in capitalism.
Yeah.
Right? So, the 1% who have succeeded in capitalism are true capitalists, as in they own equity, they've made investments, they understand money. The 99 percentile are mostly in the labor economy, and they are basically been told this unfortunate lie that work hard and you'll get there, but actually over the last 20, 30 years, you actually need to know how to invest, because essentially in an age of AI and compute, where much of the labor that you're used to actually is no longer that valuable anymore, because it's basically completely outsourced to a machine. And in fact, I think the kind of labor that we're most attuned to as humans is creative in nature, but we need to own our property. For instance, if you're a musician and you make music, but you don't own your IP, well, if that was true, then there would be no Taylor Swift. There would be no Michael Jackson, or we're in Korea, no BTS, right? It wouldn't be possible if you didn't have a way of protecting your intellectual property rights and capitalizing from those benefits. So this has to happen first. And I think we need to teach people more about the values of capitalism. I agree with you, though. If it wasn't for capitalism, we wouldn't have Tesla, we wouldn't have blockchain, we wouldn't have Bitcoin, we wouldn't have any of those sort of innovations, because capitalism provides incentive as an entrepreneur to do stuff. But we need more people to understand that it's important. We also need people to understand that property rights is actually the reason you have freedom. But if you are one of the, let's call it lower percentile, and you're struggling, you're at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, and you're really just surviving, we can't blame them for being angry when they have no solution in their mind how to get there, which is why I think Web3 solves it. Because at the end of the day, when you participate as a customer in Web3, you actually become an owner. Right? If I participate in the Ethereum ecosystem by owning just a fraction of a token, I become an owner. But in Web2, I could be a Uber driver. I never own any shares in Uber. So I just drive, I get some money paid for it. And actually what happens at the end of the day, Uber becomes valuable, but the very people who created value for Uber are left out.
Yeah.
And we know now that Uber is talking about self-driving cars, because really they don't give a fuck about the drivers. And so now you create this adversarial relationship. Whereas if Uber drivers actually would receive maybe share options or some benefit for having driven, if I'm a driver for Uber for 2 years or 3 years, why shouldn't I deserve something? Because I created value. Then I might look at the fact that they're advancing the company much better, because now my incentives are aligned, right? That's what Web3 does. You can't imagine a company having 10 or 20 or 100 million shareholders. That doesn't exist. But you can imagine a future where you can have 100 million token holders, right? And that is why I think Web3 and digital property rights is so fundamental and so important for the future of capitalism and for a fairer world in the future.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I see, like, I like the vision of Web3, and honestly, like, I'm inspired by it, but then 90% of what I see is people trying to dump on retail. Like, they have a, no,
Yes,
and
I
it
know what
really
you
does
mean.
truly upset me, because they're so, like, they go and they say, we're changing the world, we're making it better. And then again, the people at the bottom who are more uneducated, who want to believe in your vision, they spend whatever little money they have to buy the thing, and then it gets rug pulled, or like they lose everything. What do you as Animoca do when you select companies, or to ensure that they're not just going for the 1-2 year quick exit like 90% of VCs,
Sure.
unfortunately, and that they actually drive long-lasting value?
So first of all, it depends on whether you think the future for Web3 is very, where we are. And first, from our perspective, we think we're early innings. I had described this earlier, but I think Web3 is kind of like where Web2 is, so Web1 was in like 1990, 2000, right? So from my perspective, the next few decades is going to be the defining cycle of this. And, as AI and quantum computing becomes more sort of a thing, actually, I think blockchain becomes even more critical, which is a different topic altogether. But having said that, so there is essentially the long-term vision and future around that. But I would also say that for the retail investor, I think he needs to be much more discerning about how he invests. And I think part of the problem is because they're so desperate. In many ways, you know, meme coins to me is a little bit of a reflection of the times that we're in, because a lot of meme coins are effectively a kind of gambling in some ways, right? And they're cultural in one aspect, but they're also essentially gambling in another. And why do people gamble the way that they do? Because there's desperation. So I think that's something we have to recognize. Now, that said, Web3 is a new wealth class. The money that's generated and the people who buy NFTs and that kind of stuff are not people who, came from traditional banking. They're not people who even came from Silicon Valley, per se. They are people who actually really didn't have anything and made money from a new environment, whether it's like Axie players in the Philippines as an extreme example, or even the minorities in America, whether it's Latinos or other ethnic groups, Asian Americans, they all basically created new wealth, and they're a new wealth category that are sort of participating space. They came and made money and became, a middle class or maybe even upper as a result of going into a new industry. So that's absolutely happening. But we've now entered an institutional age of crypto, sort of heralded really with Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs, which tells me also that the retail needs to start looking at what's the institutional backing. Why is it relevant? Pumped Out Fund over the last 6 months basically put out 2 million tokens and more. Right? So when you think of that, there's probably millions and millions of new tokens coming out that have basically broadly diluted the ecosystem. Even though altcoins' overall market cap a year ago was 200 billion and now it's close to half a trillion, it can't compete with the millions of new tokens that are out, right? So then how do you find out which tokens are the ones that you think have a lasting power where you just don't get dumped on, or where there's just too much retail or volatility? That's the institutional side. When you think of what are the tokens that have had institutional backing, so outside of Bitcoin and Ethereum, which of course volatile, but broadly much better than a year ago, then you have Solana, right? That has institutional backing. You have Ton, right? I mean, again, from a year ago, absolutely much better. I mean, Pavel issue aside, right?
Yeah.
Still holding up pretty strongly. Mocha as well, when we launched that, in a difficult market, the backing was institutional. That held a certain type of ground level. And I think this is the next thing we need to start looking at. Not just who's behind it, who invested as a VC, but also who, from an institutional side, is supportive, and does the team have institutional capabilities? Which, again, I'm not saying every project has to do that, but that's something, especially if you're retail, you have to look at as well. I mean, it's no different than when you take a company public, and is Goldman Sachs taking you public, or is it someone that you don't know, right? There's some elements around that you need to have some awareness around that, because even though there's long-term value, you want to make sure that there's a level of education. And I also tell people that you need to understand the utility for the product as well. It's not just enough to sort of, unfortunately, a lot of people buy tokens simply because someone else bought it. And I think that while, if you're willing to sort of gamble that way, fine, but it's no different than every other product out there, right? I mean, do you buy this product or you buy this equity just because someone else is doing it? Or are you actually trying to understand its fundamentals and understanding that there's an actual growth path that's meaningful?
So I definitely want to. So one big thing that I do want to unpack, and I don't think we'll have time for it right now, is
Sure.
is like you said, like when a company goes public, there's a lot it has to do, right? It has to have a prospectus, it has to have financials, it has to have certain things on how it's contributing to society,
Yes,
whatever.
exactly.
When you do start thinking about a decentralized space, there's no central authority that regulates that decentralized space. So
No, but the decentralized authority, the decentralized ecosystem is the authority in itself, meaning that people will ultimately vote with, their confidence, and the confidence is enumerated in whether they hold the token or not, right? And that to me is actually one of the mechanisms of how do you communicate, and that's why I say the institutional era is beginning, because the institutional era expects you to do certain things and report certain things that we didn't have before. I mean, remember like the ICO scams of 2017 and 2018. I mean, there are so many of them, and the other problem is they got away because people just didn't know what to do, or law enforcement didn't know. Now, frankly speaking, you don't get away with it, right? So there's that aspect of it too. So there's a regulatory and there's the sort of crime enforcement side that is now much better at dealing with this than before. So we've got that side that's being cleaned up, and then you've also got the people who want to buy the token for the use in the game or whatever. But then they need to not just play the game, they need to know what's going on. So are you as an entity actually going to be talking about it? Are you going to be sharing updates? Are you going to do reports? Are you going to explain what's happening? Or are you just basically just going to say, forget it all, right?
Yeah.
And so you can definitely tell the difference between these projects. The projects that are more active, that are more like, whether we make many investments, whether we make activities, whether we have hackathons, like you can tell that. versus maybe the ones who might have an announcement every 6 months and do something, very little. Those are examples, for instance,
Yeah.
where you can sort of take a look at that. So I don't think it's necessarily like the same, I don't think it's exactly the same as a prospectus, although I think there's elements like the white paper. I think it's much more closer to how do you sort of demonstrate that you're building the network, that you're adding value to the network. And I think this is something that some people don't understand, or some people maybe don't want to. Remember, being a Web3 founder is very different than a Web2 founder. Web2 founders can just build in quiet, and they can raise some VC. And then when they go public, note that many of them actually are not the ones who run the public company. They bring someone else to do that part, right?
Yeah.
But in Web3, you're the same guy.
Yeah.
Right? The person who runs a public community is also the one who has to manage the private company.
Yeah.
And so I think that's harder, right? I think these are not necessarily people who understand how to draw attention, because network effects grow from attention, and they also don't really understand how to handle community in that way, which is a narrative that is critical even in the stock market. I mean, Elon Musk is a perfect example of that. But there's many other versions of him, maybe not of his scale and size, but who basically become personas, and you understand the way that he brings attention to the project is something that people in Web3 have to understand too. And not all of them are comfortable in doing that.
Yeah, so I did articles at BDO London, and we did a lot of auditing. And also, when you look at financials, it's like
Yes.
they also put some numbers together on a spreadsheet quickly before they have to issue it out. Like, you also don't know the true representation of
Right.
what has happened. So it's like financials are at a point in time, right?
Yes.
It's not like on-chain, transparent of exactly what has happened throughout the year. And I think Web3 has a strong element where
It
your
could do
reputation,
that. Exactly. Your reputation would be built up from that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. And we ourselves, as a company, as a public company, we do issue financials. So we have our quarterly financials that are out. You can go to our website and see them. You can see our last year financials as well, right? So that is another way in which we want to communicate to them about building trust and having an understanding about sort of how we operate as a business. I think these are important, even if it's not mandated, so that we can build trust in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I recently interviewed Will Griffiths from the Motiverse
Yes,
side.
yes.
I like the kind of mindset that all the companies in the Animoca brand kind of have. It's not just this Web3, let's dump on retail. It's really let's build something valuable.
Yes.
We are running out of time, so I would like to know, in the next 5 to 10 years, you say that this is going to be like the next phase of innovation. What would you like the Web3 space to look like? Or how do you see it looking?
Well, first of all, I think the Ton ecosystem is going to help onboard hundreds of millions of users, because they solve the distribution puzzle that Apple, Facebook, and those guys essentially stopped for a while. So I think that's and hopefully they'll open up when they realize that it no longer makes sense to close it off, right? So I do think that that's the first wave of sort of more mass adoption as we see it over the next 12 to 18 months. So that's super exciting. But what I really hope to see is that, through tokenization, which is effectively a form of expanded digital property rights, will have much more community ownership. So my predictions basically for that cycle that we talk about in the future is, I think there's going to be many more DAOs that are going to be bigger than companies. And in fact, I think in the long run, they will all be bigger. When you take a look at, for instance, the governance of DAOs as well, it's like close to 11 million people, like 10.9 billion people, who govern over about $20 billion worth of assets. Name me any ecosystem in the world that does that. It's only blockchain, right? Who basically govern over that. And that, to me, if you think that we're going to have 1 billion people on chain, this is going to be governing $20 billion, and it's not going to be about 10 million people. It's going to be about hundreds of millions of people